I'm a totally committed atheist, except for one thing. If there is no God, then incest is not really wrong. And I don't like that. I want it to be really wrong. And the only way that can happen is if there's a God.
So I wanted to ask you your opinion about how to deal with bumps in our relationship with God. You know, there are times that people sometimes have experiences that cause them to go into a faith crisis, and they start questioning everything about the relationship with God. And many times this is precipitated because they had an experience with a human being that could have been unintentional. It could have been, let's say, a parent who didn't have the tools of how to parent, but they represented God to that child. So the child could have associated that person with religion, and they wanted to separate themselves from religion because they had a bad taste in their mouth because of what that person represented. Or they could have had a bad experience with a faith leader, somebody who was pretending to be one way and then they were really leading a double life. It could have been an experience with, a businessman who ostensibly was religious, but they were engaged in fraudulent practices, whatever. There are many different things that could set a person who is authentically trying to serve God into a faith crisis. And instead of just questioning the person, they actually question God because that person is representing God to them. So how do you survive a faith crisis after having your world shaken up by experiencing a scenario similar to this or different?
Is a faith crisis any different than a marriage crisis? Obviously, if you have a faith crisis, your relationship with God is not very strong, not very real. It's like a third party, third hand relationship. Your parents, your teacher, your preacher, your whatever, you never made any contact with God, which is already not nice. So start all over. Make your own connection to God and then decide what you think.
Is it fair to say that there was no connection with God?
Well, it was kind of shabby, but
Immature, maybe.
secondhand. It's what you heard about him from somebody. That's not exactly the way you conduct a relationship. It's also not the way you judge people. You can't judge someone you never talked to based on what somebody said about him or the way somebody made him sound or look. It's not personal and it's not justice.
So how does a person develop that relationship with God? I assume you're saying we're moving from this is my father's God to this is a Zakeli relationship. This is my God. I own the relationship. How do you move to that stage?
Well, you got to ask yourself the question, what is your connection to God? Why did you once believe in him? Why would you even consider believing in him? Why?
That can throw a person into an even deeper crisis. Then they have to start all the way from the bottom up. They have to dig for all the answers.
Yeah.
Where do they even go? How do you find those answers?
That's a good question, but that's what has to happen, and that's the good news. The good news is when a shallow relationship fails, you go for a deeper one rather than none at all. That's how a marriage survives a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting thing. Men who cheat on their wives don't divorce them. It's a common thing. In fact, I was talking to a class many years ago of intense feminists, whatever. Anyway, when they heard that having two wives used to be permissible, They went into a fury. Why? How come? Blah, blah, blah. And this one woman was leading the charge. She was like very, very upset. I spoke to her a day later, privately, and she told me that her husband is having an affair. And it's been going on for years. So I asked her, how do you handle that? She says, I just work my schedule around hers. I didn't mean how do you handle it in terms of time. So you're the one who's complaining? You're actually doing it. Unfortunately, that's very common. But it's interesting that in reality, in real life, women don't divorce their husbands for cheating. They create a crisis, which is good, but then they work on resolution. So the same is true with God. If a relationship that falls apart, you go deeper. It's impressive.
I think a part of it is also that you stop relying on human beings. Because if a human being had to be your face of God, if that's your representation of God, if that's who you look up to and you trust, and they fail, then your trust was placed in the wrong thing.
There's a guy who came to a Rebbe for a bracha. The Rebbe said, I'm sorry, I don't have a bracha for you. And I said, what do you mean? You have a bracha for everybody. He said, if I don't have a bracha, there's nothing I can give you. I can't make one up. Anyway, the guy got frustrated. He said, fine, I'll rely on God and God will help me. So the Rebbe said, oh, now I can give you a bracha.
Yeah.
If you thought you're coming to me instead of God, then I can't give you a bracha.
So what would be a way that a person could develop a real, authentic relationship with God? What would be the path forward?
So it depends on the individual, on the personality. It has to be, each according to his mentality. An intellectual, for example, his connection to God begins with who created the world? Who's the creator? Where did all this come from? How do we explain life? More philosophical, is there a purpose? Is there a designer? Is there a mind behind creation? Person a little more emotional. How can you be optimistic if there's no God in charge? And life is a jungle and the world is ugly and nasty and threatening. How do you survive that? So you're looking for an emotional reassurance that there is some rhyme and reason to what's going on. There are even people who are looking for authority and discipline. People are actually afraid of the fact that they can do whatever they want. It scares them more than the fact that everybody else can do whatever they want. I'm not afraid that somebody is going to come kill me. I'm afraid I'm going to kill somebody. So they need something to kind of put some borders and put some restraints on their own behavior. So they love the idea that God is king and he's the authority and he punishes you.
I think that's actually hardwired into human beings. Human beings want to know that there's an authority. I had a story with my daughter when she was probably about a year and a half. We were staying in a group home where we were working with special needs children over Shabbos, and there was this huge flight of stairs with like 30 steps. And my daughter had just been practicing going up and down stairs, but I always had a baby gate, so it'd be like 4 or 5 steps up so she wouldn't fall. And she was terrified. She needed that baby gate there. In order for her to feel safe, she had to know that there's a limit. There's something that's going to help me not hurt myself. I think that's very hardwired into human beings.
Mhm.
We need to know that there's an authority.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So each person has to approach God in with the gateway or the opening that exists for them. Then, of course, you can develop the relationship into something richer and more nuanced. But you got to start with where you're at. Why would you even want a relationship?
No, what's the answer?
So to each person, it's because I have to have an answer for who created the world.
Uh-huh.
I hate puzzles. So I want to unpuzzle this. Or I need the security, I need the reassurance, I need the purposefulness of it. There's one guy who said, I'm a totally committed atheist, except for one thing. If there is no God, then incest is not really wrong. And I don't like that. I want it to be really wrong. And the only way that can happen is if there's a God, which is insightful.
You can't have morality without a divine creator.
An absolute morality.
Right, right. It can fluctuate if it's just based upon a human being.
Yeah. So here's a very important hashkafa issue. What makes incest wrong? So there are people who assume incest is wrong. And the Eberstedt is enforcing that rule. Other people believe there's nothing wrong with incest. The Eberstedt said no. And when he says no, it's wrong. So which is the right way? That gets us to the question of where did Torah come from? Where does Torah originate? We know that the Eberstedt created the physical world 6,000 years ago. When did he create the Torah? When did he sit down to compose the Ten Commandments? When did he decide that there should be 10? He started making a list, and after the 10th, he ran out of, couldn't think of anything else. When exactly did Torah develop in God's mind? The only correct answer, it didn't develop. This is him. Torah is as ancient as he is, as eternal as he is. As long as there's a God, there is a Torah. They're inseparable. They're synonyms. God is Torah, Torah is God. So when the Medrash says, Bereshis bara elikim es hashamayim ve'es ha'aretz, bishvil, why did he create it? For the Torah. Okay, so obviously the Torah existed first, but we know that. Torah was the blueprint, so it existed before creation. But what does that mean? It existed before creation. Before all creation. Before the creation of right and wrong, good and bad, high and low, before any of that existed, the Torah existed. So that means incest is wrong. Because it causes diseases in children? No. Because it's a sin and it separates you from God? No. Before there is separation, before there is disease, before there is creation, incest is wrong. Why? Because that's how God feels. And why does he feel that way? Because that's how he feels. That's what we mean by chukim. The commandments don't have reasons because they existed before reason was invented. So we say Torah is God's chachma. That could be misleading. If it's your chachma, then it's not you. It's something you acquire. You get smart with age. So when we say it's God's chachma, that's not where it started. It started long before there was chachma. It started when there was just him. God and his Torah. Eventually, it presented itself in chachma. And some didn't. The ones that don't present themselves in chachma, those are chukim. But they all started off being chukim. That's why Na'aseh v'nishma makes sense. We will do it because it's you. And we will try to understand it because you want us to.